Okay, welcome to this revision PowerPoint which will look at aid for GCSE Geography OCR Syllabus B. In this PowerPoint we'll look at what aid is, what types of aid there are including advantages and disadvantages, and also look at a case study. There are many different types of aid which may confuse you, and we need to be aware of what the different types of aid are, their advantages and disadvantages. So we'll look at bilateral aid, multilateral aid, voluntary aid in terms of NGOs, short-term aid which is normally given in emergencies and relief, and long-term aid which is supposed to be developmental and sustainable aid. So aid is normally, as it says here, a term used to describe the transfer of money, equipment, manpower to another country, and its objective is to benefit the recipient country. Aid is given by one country to another country in the form of money or resources. The country that gives aid is called the donor, and the one that gets aid is called the recipient. And there are two main sources of aid for donor countries, which is normally governments, which are paid for by taxes, and non-government organisations, which are normally paid for by voluntary organisations. There are two different ways donor governments can give aid to recipient countries, normally either directly, which is called bilateral aid, or indirectly, which is normally from the World Bank or the United Nations. The world's richest 22 nations pledged to contribute about 0.7% of their own GNP for overseas development. At the moment, the UK government gives around 0.52% of their GNP, with the highest contributor being Sweden. Here's an example with regard to food aid. Who gives money to other countries in terms of food? And you can see it's mostly MEDCs from this very distorted map. So blue right at the top is Canada, with just to the left and also to the south of there is the United States. European countries indicated in pink, with Japan indicated in the more purple colour and Australia in yellow. As you can see, very few African countries give aid to each other. And here are the main recipient countries in the world with their various different levels of aid which is received. And as you can see, not a surprise, it's mostly African countries which receive a lot of aid. Indeed, the top 5 are included there, and if you look at the percentage, it's the percentage of their GNP which is given to them. So what are these different types of aid? Well, I suppose short-term aid can be described as relief aid that solves an immediate crisis, maybe after a natural disaster or in war. So that might be in terms of medical supplies, food or blankets. It's said to be not sustainable because it's often withdrawn after a crisis diminishes and isn't really developmental. I suppose its advantages are that it is immediate. And then there are the many types of long-term aid, which has a purpose to develop the quality of life of individuals and communities over time. These schemes often help countries to develop, and hopefully over time they become less reliant on it. However, the time taken for the benefits to be felt can be considerably longer. Voluntary aid is funded by the public through non-government organisations. These are charities that rely on donations or money raised through appeals. Projects targeted at helping the most in need. It can be said that sometimes it's similar to relief aid, i.e. it might look at drought affected areas and how people might actually get water, but it isn't always the case. Bilateral aid can be tied. This means it's given on the condition that the recipient country has to buy the goods or services it needs from the donor country. This helps the economy of the donor country. However, if the goods and services are expensive in the donor country, the aid doesn't go very far, as it would if the goods and services were bought elsewhere. Also, we can consider the fact that it has a main difference in that it often funds large-scale projects such as dams and power stations. There may be some political influence or strategic motives that actually create this dependency. And there's also multilateral aid, which are normally donations which are pooled from a number of countries and distributed through the international organisations such as the World Bank or the United Nations. The main thing we need to always consider is how sustainable are these developments that are taking place in these poor countries. Are they really going to consider the needs of future generations as well as the needs of the people today? Does it take into account the earth and its resources and how they should be given over from one generation to the next? Is it going to be sustained in the long term? It should also involve the local people and the knowledge of the technologies and access to resources they need to maintain their development. And it should hopefully use resources that will not run out. Do all of these projects do that? It's often that the exam board will ask you how sustainable any development project is. So how can development be affected by aid? There are many benefits. Like I've said, aid can be producing and providing new technology and machinery which can result in more jobs and enable farmers to grow crops for export instead of many of them being needed on the farm. Some children might be able to go into work after they've been to school, and exports can help a country in terms of its development. There might be new infrastructure projects such as roads, power stations. These might encourage multinational corporations to move into the country, which again can provide jobs and, including taxes, help the development of a country. But small-scale projects should improve the quality of life. However, it's said that there are some shortcomings. Large schemes may have unintended environmental and social consequences. Aid may not benefit the poorest people, and often the foreign aid is bilateral aid, which is, like I said, is tied. Is foreign aid successful? This has been asked many times by the exam board. Like we said, aid is tied, mostly benefiting the donor country. Aid may actually increase the dependency on the donor country over a period of time, and projects might actually be inappropriate for the needs of the people. It might ignore smaller scale projects such as what is actually needed in countries like water filters, mosquito nets, which have more impact in that country. Aid sometimes doesn't reach the people who need it due to corruption and the inability of governments to actually process food for the people. Aid is sometimes inefficient with some governments as well. Aid sometimes doesn't get to where it's needed in short-term aid because of infrastructure problems after natural disasters. And like we said, it does take time to be effective, and aid is often given as a loan, which can lead to the country being in debt over a large period of time. So can quality of life indicators measure the success of foreign aid? Well, I suppose in many ways they can, because if the literacy rate improves, this can show how people can access education. If foreign aid is given, will the infant mortality rate drop? And will have been an improvement in antenatal care. If there's been some foreign aid given, will the calorie intake improve and therefore show an improvement in diet? If there is foreign aid given, will the death rate change and actually drop, which means there's been improvements in vaccines, medicines, diets, food supply and water supply. A good example, which is fairly easy to remember, is Goat Aid, which is a Christian aid development by a non-government organisation. In lots of cases in this section of the course, they've asked you to be aware of one type of aid and what benefits and problems it actually has. Well, goat aid does have many benefits. The goat is given, and when this goat eats, the manure it produces will increase the soil fertility. If the soil is more fertile, it will mean that more crops can be grown. It may improve the people's diets, because they will have various different sources of food if crops are grown. It will mean that they have an income from selling the milk that the goats produce, and with that income they can buy food, clothes, a uniform, and possibly go to school. And when these goats mate and reproduce, male offspring can be sold. It's said that it's sustainable, but why? The benefits are passed on to other families as goats are returned over a period of time. It is fairly low standard technology, so there's no expensive machinery which may actually break or need repair, and it leads to improvements in people's lives, so they've got better prospects in education.